Hey guys, so we're finally at the end of this sub-series looking at our nation's historic Prime Ministers. To finally bring us back to the modern era, we're going to look at the Prime Ministers of the 50s/60s coalition government, starting with our longest serving Prime Minister, Sir Robert Gorton Menzies. Now a reminder before we begin that this video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Mike Rand, Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, Edward Pierre, Jezza, newcomers Willow and Noah Morgan, and a special mention to ARW for their contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Sawmon video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. Starting off, we have Luca Pikachu, who says, Robert Menzies, always there for us, and a leader of an undefeated government of the 50s and 60s. Meanwhile, for a more detailed take, we have ARW, who says, as the founder of the modern Liberal Party of Australia and leader of the party through its first 20 years, Robert Menzies is unquestionably the single most influential figure for the political right to ever become Prime Minister of Australia, and all his successors as Liberal leaders have followed his example to some degree. Long active in both Victorian and national politics through the 1920s and 30s, Menzies first became Prime Minister following the death of Joseph Lyons in April 1939, and within a few months became a wartime leader as Australia followed Britain into the Second World War following Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939. Menzies' political position through his first term was weak, however. The United Australia Party he led was ideologically aimless, overly dependent on support from his business interests, and full of bitter internal rivalries. He also spent much of his first term in minority, initially when the Country Party withdrew support for the coalition at Earl Page's spiteful insistence, and again after the 1940 election when neither party could gain a majority of seats. Menzies spent much of the early 1941 in Europe overseeing the war effort, but returned to Australia in mid-1941 to find his support within the UAP in terminal decline. He resigned in August 1941 and could only watch from the backbenches as the coalition lost the minority support to Labour, who would govern through the rest of the war and overall be far more successful. After the coalition was decimated in the 1943 election, the UAP turned back to Menzies, who by this time had reasserted himself as an intellectual leader of the right side of Australian politics through a series of radio addresses that compounded his key political beliefs and principles. The most important of these was the Forgotten People's speech, which essentially identified the middle class of Australia's most important constituencies and continues to guide the Liberal Party's overall approach to politics to this day. Renewed with his purpose, Menzies proceeded to overhaul the UAP in 1944 and replace it with the Liberal Party of Australia, emphasising it as a Liberal Party to contrast the perceived socialism of Labour and ensuring the party's organisation would not be affected by the same defects as the UAP and its predecessors. While unable to put a dent in the popular chiefless government in 1946, Menzies was stepped into victory in 1949 and proceeded to govern for a further uninterrupted 16 years until his retirement in early 1966. His total of 18 years as Prime Minister makes him Australia's longest serving Prime Minister by far. Menzies' long second term was characterised by Australia's strong post-war economic growth and his own steady management of it. He was able to secure so many electoral victories due to Labour's political difficulties, with the mid-1950s split particularly contributing to Labour's long-term opposition. Critics of Menzies argue he was not particularly ambitious as a leader, and that rather than being a leader of high principle, he cynically relied on the political tactics that kept his opposition divided to endure for as long as he did. Menzies' overall worldview and approach to politics, anchored in the British imperialism and protectionism of the early 1900s, was also seen by many as out of date by the mid-1960s, and even many of his own side largely distanced themselves from those sentiments after he stepped down. Nonetheless, he did retire on his own terms, which no Prime Minister has been able to do since, and he left his successor in a very stable set of circumstances to continue his legacy. And now for my take. It's no surprise that Menzies is constantly brought up as the gold standard for Liberal Prime Ministers. His incredible 7 straight election wins is a feat I doubt we'll ever see again, unless we descended to an autocratic dictatorship led by the God Emperor himself, Clive Palmer. It's strange to think that Menzies' first time as Prime Minister was quite the failure. Had Menzies only served his first term as Prime Minister, I doubt anyone would remember him, but as we know, he came back in a big way in 1949 and wouldn't stop being Prime Minister until he decided that he had done enough and retired. To date, Menzies is the last Prime Minister to retire on his own accord, rather than being forced out by his own party, or, in the case of Harold Holt, the Grim Reaper. While I agree with ARW that in some respects Menzies benefited from Labour constantly shooting themselves in the foot during this era, his moderate approach to implementing both left and right-wing reforms when needed was really what made the Liberal Party such a successful party during this era. Ironically, I feel like today the modern Labour Party has taken this approach way more than the modern Liberal Party. While I respect Menzies as a Prime Minister, I don't think I ever would have voted for him. He was definitely a massive political opportunist, frequently calling early elections and creating wedge issues to stump the Labour Party, rather than seek bilateral support. I guess some things never change. So while I respect him, he's definitely not one of my top Prime Ministers, nor is he my favourite Liberal Prime Minister, as we're getting to him soon. ARW says, Howard Holt was well placed to continue Menzies' legacy in the late 1960s, being of a younger generation more in touch with modern Australia, but also having extensive experience in government, dating back to Menzies' first government in the early 1940s. And in his first year, Holt proved to be indeed quite popular, with his stance on the Vietnam War getting him wide approval in its initial stages. He achieved one of the largest electoral victories ever against a hapless Labour Party in the late 1966, and looked to continue the Liberal Party's two-decade rule to the end of the 1960s. Throughout 1967, Holt's command of his party began to wane, however. His collegial leadership style, which initially was seen as refreshing in contrast to Menzies' more autocratic management of the cabinet, eventually saw backbench MPs within his party increasingly speak against the party's policy, which undermined his leadership. The Labour Party also finally decided to embrace the swinging 60s and elect Gough Whitlam as leader, who actually proved to be far more capable as an opposition leader than his two predecessors, but winning two crucial by-elections and reducing the coalition's numbers in the Senate, so they would no longer hold a majority. The Vietnam War also became increasingly unpopular and was subject to many protests throughout 1967. By the end of 1967, an exhausted Holt retreated to his holiday home on the Mornington Peninsula of South Melbourne, which had long been a favourite swimming spot of his despite the region notoriously rough surf. Tragically, Holt disappeared during the swim off Cheviot Beach and his body was never recovered. Presumed dead, Holt was farewelled at a funeral the following week, while the Liberal Party struggled to sort through various internal tensions to find a suitable leader to replace him. Overall, Holt proved to be something of a transitional Prime Minister between the more conservative Menzies government and the increasingly social liberal demands of the late 60s society that were later embraced by Whitlam. He did oversee crucial changes such as the replacement of Australia's pound with a dollar and the 1967 referendum to include Indigenous Australians in the national census, which was an overwhelming success and resulted in further federal involvement in Indigenous affairs. While not without merits, Holt's term as Prime Minister was quite brief, and he has long been overshadowed by the unique circumstances of his disappearance, which continues to be discussed by everyday Australians to this day. And now for my take. Holt's infamous disappearance at Cheviot Beach has unfortunately covered up his legacy as Prime Minister. Maybe that's a good thing, as had he gone into the 1969 election, he likely would have lost to the resurging Labour Party under Gough Whitlam. While Holt will be remembered as the man responsible for the creation of the Australian dollar, advancement of Aboriginal rights, and ending the White Australia policy, he was also responsible for allowing cracks to form in the coalition government, which would begin the vicious infighting which led to the party's downfall in 1972. Well, it might surprise you, but no one bothered to give me a take on John McEwen, so I guess I'm on my own for this one. McEwen is somewhat famous for being the last Prime Minister older than the nation of Australia, even if it was only by a few months. Like a lot of Country Party members, he has a long service history in Canberra, serving a whopping 33 years in Parliament before becoming Prime Minister. Despite the wait, he didn't actually do much as Prime Minister outside of stopping William McMahon becoming the next Prime Minister, which ended up happening anyway. So yeah, not really opinionated on this guy, so let's just move on. ARW says the leadership vacuum following Holt's death was filled in January 1968 by a rather unlikely candidate. John Gorton had held several ministerial positions since the late 1950s, but none never seriously considered a future leader until he became the most prominent during Holt's time as Prime Minister. Despite sitting in the Senate, some Liberals saw Gorton as a good replacement for Holt due to his strong media profile and his likeable larkin personality that could keep the party in a competitive position against the Labour Party of Gough Whitlam. Gordon won the ballot and became Prime Minister, moving into the House of Representatives in Holt's old seat. The circumstances of Gordon's ascension are a good case study on the importance of communication and public relations in the changing media landscape of the 1960s, a trend that has only intensified a half-century since. As for Gordon's record as Prime Minister, it's a bit of a mixed bag. For a Liberal, Gordon was ahead of his time, who believed in a stronger role for the federal government at the expense of the states, or this contravened the traditional Liberal stance of preserving states' rights and provoked conflict with the more liberal state premiers. Gordon also increased funding for the arts and increased federal involvement in social services and the environment. Gordon's everyman image was initially a refreshing contrast to the more stiffer upper lips of preceding Prime Ministers, though more prudish colleagues deemed it un-prime ministerial, and Gordon's alleged heavy drinking and womanising were frequent topics of gossip. Gorton was also a poor manager of cabinet, and he often made decisions without informing the relevant ministers. Gorton could have prevailed if he was able to overcome these initial deficiencies to win public support, but even on this measure he failed to meet expectations. He lost the popular vote in the 1969 election to Labour and only retained a majority of government by 3 seats. This was Whitlam's first election and set the stage for his ultimate victory over the coalition in 1972. Gorton never made it to that election as leader, as his time as Prime Minister came to an ugly end when a dispute with his Defence Minister Malcolm Fraser saw Fraser resign and launch verbal assaults on Gorton's performance in Parliament in 1971. So devastating was the speech that Gorton had no choice but to call for a vote of confidence in his leadership, the result of which was a 50-50 split. Interpreting this as insufficient confidence in his leadership, Gorton fell on his own sword and resigned the leadership. Gorton would later quit the Liberal Party in disgust when Malcolm Fraser became leader in 1975 and unsuccessfully attempted to stand at the 1975 election as an independent senator, after which he never became involved in politics again and never forgave Fraser for contributing to his downfall. While it would be a stretch to call Gorton a good Prime Minister, his attempts to modernise the Liberal Party and expand the role of the federal government were admirable, and I personally find him to be the most interesting of the post-Menzies coalition Prime Ministers. I feel like it could have amounted to more if he was able to win a stronger victory in 1969, but Whitlam proved to be too strong of an opponent, and the internal tensions within the Liberal Party were beyond him to manage. And now for my take. So, you want to know who my favourite Liberal Prime Minister is? Well, you're looking at him. To me, Gorton was the man who never really wanted to be Prime Minister, and it shows that he lacked the political ambitions of other Liberal leaders. This lack of ambition meant that Gorton was not one to play politics 24/7 like so many other Liberals. Instead, he was focused on modernising the country and doing what he thought was best for the nation, and I really respect him for that. If there was ever a Liberal Prime Minister to get me, a card-carrying member of the Labour Party, to vote for him in an election, it was John Grey Gorton. It was a shame they didn't get much time to be Prime Minister, thanks in part due to our next person. ARW says, and last and most definitely least, we have William McMahon. It's a great quirk of Australian history that any individual as unimpressive as McMahon was ever able to become Prime Minister, and the fact that he did indicates how poor the culture was within the Liberal Party at the time. Elected to Parliament in 1949, McMahon had a variety of frontbench positions throughout the Menzies government. It was during this period that McMahon's reputation as a hard-working, albeit completely untrustworthy politician who routinely leaked government secrets to journalists and lobbyists became established. After Menzies' retirement, McMahon was elected as deputy leader of the Liberal Party and was appointed treasurer under Holt. It was due to occupying these senior positions that McMahon was considered the front one to become Prime Minister following Holt's disappearance at the end of 1967. John McEwen, of course, would ensure that this did not happen, though McMahon continued to be treasurer and later Foreign Affairs Minister in Gorton's government. McMahon continually undermined Gorton through his leadership, and when Gorton fell in 1971, McMahon stood for the leadership and won. The infighting surrounding Gorton's downfall was so intense that it would have taken a politician of extraordinary ability to reinvigorate such a bitterly divided party. McMahon, of course, did not possess such an ability, and his brief 2 years in government contained very little in terms of policy advancement and seemed to be exercised in keeping the government alive until it met its inevitable defeat in the 1972 election. However, it was at this election that McMahon performed above expectations as he limited the coalition's election loss to just 8 seats, leaving the incumbent Whitlam government with a small majority to govern from, as well as lacking a majority in the Senate. If McMahon had led the party to oblivion on a scale similar to Scott Morrison's loss in 2022, the Whitlam government most likely would never have come to its premature end in 1975. But that is really the most that can be said that is positive about McMahon, as he truly was a pitiful figure who embroidered every negative stereotype there is about cynical, self-interested politicians. It's especially galling that a figure as impressive as Scott Whitlam was immediately preceded by someone so completely lacking in intellect, public speaking skills, and discernible interest in advancing the common good of his country. McMahon's reputation as a national laughingstock endures to this day, as he's long been considered one of Australia's absolute worst Prime Ministers. And now for my take. Much like John McEwen, I don't really have much to say about William McMahon. I don't think he's our worst Prime Minister, as we have 2 much more recent candidates for that spot. However, I don't think he was that impressive, although, as ARW says, limiting Whitlam's 1972 win and setting the coalition up for a quick comeback is at least something to be proud of. And with that, we are done covering the historic Prime Ministers. I'm sorry this took so long, but now we can finally jump back to the present day and finally talk about our former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So to sort of leave your takes in either the comment section of this video or on my Patreon if you want to see them featured in the next video. Remember though, please be respectful. I know a lot of you have very strong feelings on our 30th Prime Minister, but I still need the comments to be G-rated for my video, so any profanity-filled remarks will not be read out. With that disclaimer out of the way, I look forward to seeing you next time.